The veil smelled like Tessa's perfume. That was the detail Lyra couldn't shake as she stood alone in the dressing room of St. Jude's Chapel, her fingers trembling against the heavy silk fabric while she read her sister's message for the third time. "I'm sorry. I can't do this. I'm already past the state line. You know what happens to the family if nobody walks down that aisle. I'm sorry, Lyra. Please." Lyra stared at the phone screen until the words blurred. Then she looked up at the mirror. The wedding dress didn't fit her properly. Tessa was taller by 2 inches and narrower in the shoulders, so the gown hung oddly at the collarbone and pulled too tight across Lyra's arms. The veil, at least, covered most of her face. That was the only mercy she had right now. Through the oak doors, she could hear 200 guests shuffling in their seats. Somewhere out there sat her parents, her uncle, the entire executive board of Sterling & Associates, her family's financial consulting firm that was currently drowning in $18 million of debt. Debt that would be erased the moment a Sterling bride said "I do" to Kaelen Drake. And Tessa, the bride who had agreed to this arrangement 4 months ago, was now somewhere on a highway, heading south, leaving nothing behind except a text message and a cloud of expensive perfume on a borrowed veil. Lyra set the phone down on the vanity. She pressed both hands flat against the marble surface and watched her knuckles turn white. She had exactly 2 options: walk out of the chapel and let her family collapse under the weight of a debt that would destroy everything: her parents' home, her younger brother's college fund, the jobs of 60 employees who had nothing to do with any of this. Or she could pull this veil down tight, step through those doors, and marry a man she had never spoken to directly in her life. A man most people in Manhattan's financial circles referred to as the Drake. Kaelen Drake, 28 years old, owner of Drake Maritime, one of the largest independent shipping operations on the eastern seaboard. And, if you believed the rumors that circulated after midnight at industry events, the quietly acknowledged leader of an underground syndicate that moved more than cargo through those ports. Lyra believed the rumors. She was an investigative analyst by trade. She'd spent 2 years running independent risk assessments on corporate networks up and down the coast, funded by an anonymous research grant she'd never been able to trace. In that time, she had seen Kaelen Drake's name appear in enough peripheral data streams to know that his operation had layers most people never saw. And now, she was going to marry him. She pulled the veil down, picked up the bouquet from the side table, and walked to the doors. The chapel organ started playing the moment she appeared at the end of the aisle. Lyra kept her steps measured, her chin level, her breathing controlled. She could feel her mother's gaze from the third pew. Her father sat rigid, staring straight ahead with the expression of a man watching a business transaction proceed on schedule. Nobody seemed to notice the dress didn't fit right. Nobody could see her face clearly through the heavy silk veil. And nobody in this room, apparently, cared enough to ask whether the woman walking toward the altar was actually Tessa Sterling. Kaelen Drake stood at the front of the chapel in a dark charcoal suit, hands clasped in front of him. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from the photographs, with dark hair cut close and a jawline that looked like it had been designed to intimidate boardrooms. His eyes tracked her approach the way someone watches a chess piece move across the board. Steady, calculating, patient. Lyra reached the altar. The officiant spoke. She responded at the right moments, keeping her voice low enough that the slight difference in pitch from Tessa's wouldn't register with anyone sitting more than 10 feet away. When the officiant asked for the final vows, Kaelen turned to face her fully. For a single, terrifying second, his gaze dropped to the place where the dress pulled at her shoulders. The one detail that would have confirmed immediately that she wasn't the original bride. He didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. "I do," he said, his voice carrying clear and even through the chapel. Lyra swallowed. "I do." And just like that, it was done. There was no reception. The moment the officiant closed his book, Kaelen placed his hand at the small of her back, a light, guiding pressure, and walked her directly past the guests, through the side entrance, and into the evening air, where a black, armored SUV idled at the curb. A driver held the door open without making eye contact. Lyra climbed in. Kaelen followed. The door closed behind them, and the vehicle pulled away from St. Jude's before the guests had even risen from their seats. The inside of the SUV was quiet. Tinted windows turned the Manhattan streetlights into soft amber smears. Lyra sat with her hands folded in her lap, the bouquet abandoned on the seat between them. She hadn't spoken a word to this man outside the scripted vows, and she had no idea what he expected now. "You can take off the veil," Kaelen said. His voice was low, unhurried. "It must be uncomfortable." Lyra reached up slowly and pulled the silk away from her face. Cool air hit her skin, and she exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Kaelen looked at her directly then, full eye contact, and his expression held something she didn't expect. Recognition. Like he already knew exactly who was sitting across from him. He reached into the compartment beside his seat and pulled out a device, a tablet. Slim, dark-cased, with a matte screen protector and a specific brand of encrypted security overlay that Lyra recognized instantly because she used the exact same model for her investigative work. It was a custom configuration. Only about 40 of them existed. He held it out to her. "This is yours," he said, "loaded with full network access to every system you'll need going forward." Lyra took the tablet, but didn't look at it. She looked at him. "You know I'm not Tessa." "I know." He settled back against the leather seat, his expression unchanged. "I knew your sister would run. I've known for approximately 6 weeks." The city moved past them in silence for a moment. "Then why go through with it?" Lyra asked. Kaelen turned his head slightly, and for the first time, something shifted behind his eyes. Something that wasn't cold strategy or corporate maneuvering. It was closer to certainty. "Because Tessa was never the bride I wanted," he said. "You were. You've always been the one I was after, Lyra. Your sister running was the last step in making sure you'd be the one standing at that altar." The SUV turned onto the expressway, heading east toward Long Island, and Lyra sat perfectly still, holding a tablet she hadn't asked for, wearing a dress that didn't belong to her, married to a man who had just told her, with absolute calm, that everything she thought had gone wrong tonight had actually gone exactly according to his plan. The Drake estate appeared through the windshield like something carved out of the coastline itself. Stone walls, sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling glass panels that reflected the moonlight off the Long Island Sound. The SUV passed through 2 separate security checkpoints before reaching the main entrance, each one staffed by men who looked like they belonged on military detail rather than residential property. Lyra counted cameras as they drove up the gravel path. 14 visible, probably twice that number hidden. Whatever Kaelen Drake was protecting inside this compound, he took it seriously. The vehicle stopped at the front portico, and the driver opened her door without a word. Lyra stepped out into salt air and the distant sound of waves against rock. The estate was isolated, no neighboring properties visible in any direction, just dark water and the faint glow of the mainland across the Sound. Kaelen came around the vehicle and walked toward the entrance. He didn't wait for her, didn't offer his arm, didn't perform any of the gestures a new husband might be expected to make on his wedding night. He simply moved forward and expected her to follow. She followed, because right now, following was the only way to gather information. Inside, the estate was larger than it appeared from the exterior. A central foyer opened into a wide corridor, lined with contemporary art and recessed lighting. Staff moved through the background quietly. She counted 3 in the first 60 seconds, and none of them looked at her with surprise or curiosity. They had been expecting her. Kaelen stopped at the base of a floating staircase and turned to face her. "Your rooms are on the second floor, east wing. Anything you need will be provided. The kitchen operates around the clock." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a slim metallic card, matte black with a single embedded chip. "This gives you full access to every part of the residence." Lyra took the key card and turned it over in her fingers. "Every part?" "There's one exception. The archive in the basement level has a reinforced glass enclosure. That room requires a separate authorization." He said it plainly, the way someone might mention that a particular closet had a sticky lock. No warning in his tone, no threat, just a fact. "I'll let you settle in," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." Then he walked away down the west corridor and disappeared around a corner. And Lyra was standing alone in a stranger's house with a keycard and a wedding ring that still felt warm from the chapel. Her rooms turned out to be an entire suite. Bedroom, private office, bathroom with a view of the Sound. Her suitcase was already there, sitting at the foot of the bed. She hadn't packed it. Someone had collected her things from her apartment in Brooklyn, which meant Kaelen's people had access to her home, her personal space, her life, well before tonight. She should have felt violated. Instead, she felt something closer to professional respect for the level of preparation involved. And that reaction bothered her more than anything else. Lyra changed out of Tessa's wedding dress and into her own clothes, dark jeans, a grey pullover, flat shoes. She hung the dress in the closet without ceremony and sat down at the desk in the office space. The encrypted tablet Kaelen had given her in the SUV was already synced to the estate's secure network. She opened it and began running her standard access protocols, the same diagnostic routines she used when evaluating corporate security systems for her investigative work. The estate's network was sophisticated, military-grade encryption on every node, compartmentalized data storage, clean digital architecture with almost no exploitable gaps. Almost. The archive in the basement, the one room Kaelen had told her she couldn't enter, appeared on the network map as a single, isolated node, connected to the main system through a dedicated fiber line with its own power supply. It was locked behind biometric access and a rotating cipher key. Lyra studied the configuration for 20 minutes. Then she ran a passive scan through the fiber connection, using a technique she had developed during a corporate fraud investigation 2 years ago. The scan wouldn't trigger any alarms because it didn't attempt to breach the security layer. It simply read the metadata signatures of the files stored on the other side. What came back made her sit up straight in her chair. The archive didn't contain what she expected. There were no weapons inventories, no smuggling routes, no records of illegal transactions. The files stored behind that reinforced glass wall were organized into 2 primary categories. The first was a complete set of archived dossiers on Sterling and Associates, her family's firm. Financial statements going back 15 years, personnel files, internal communications, board meeting minutes. Someone had been building a comprehensive intelligence profile on her family's business for over a decade, and the depth of the research was staggering. The second category stopped her cold. It was a research sponsorship account, active, fully funded, running through a series of anonymous offshore holding structures that she recognized immediately because she had spent months trying to trace them without success. This was the grant, her grant. The anonymous funding source that had bankrolled her entire independent investigative career for the past 2 years. Every research tool she owned, every database subscription she maintained, every contract she had taken on as a freelance analyst, all of it traced back to money that originated from this room, inside this estate, managed by the man she had married 3 hours ago. Lyra closed the tablet and stared at the dark screen. Kaelen Drake had been funding her work, quietly, anonymously, for 2 full years. He had watched her build her career, develop her methods, establish her reputation in corporate risk analysis, and he had made sure she had the resources to do it. Every anonymous deposit that had appeared in her research account, every equipment upgrade she had received through unmarked channels, every database access code that had arrived without explanation in her encrypted inbox. All of it led back here. She stood up and walked to the window. The sound was black and flat under the moonlight, stretching toward the mainland where the city glowed faint on the horizon. He hadn't just known Tessa would run. He had spent years positioning the board so that when she did, Lyra would be the one who stepped forward. The funding, the career support, the marriage arrangement with her family, each piece fit into the next with the precision of someone who thought 5 moves ahead and never acted without certainty. The question that kept turning in her mind wasn't why he had done it. The question was what he had seen in her that made him so sure she was worth all of this, and whether the answer to that question would make her feel valued or terrified. She set the keycard on the nightstand, turned off the lights, and lay down in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house that belonged to her husband, trying to fall asleep while the weight of 2 years of anonymous generosity pressed against her chest like a hand she couldn't see. 2 days passed before Kaelen spoke to her about anything beyond logistics. He was courteous in the way a well-run hotel is courteous. Meals appeared on time, her requests were handled within minutes, and the staff treated her with careful professionalism. But Kaelen himself remained at a distance, disappearing into the west wing of the estate for hours, or leaving the compound entirely in one of 3 identical black vehicles that rotated through the front drive. Lyra used the time to work. The encrypted tablet gave her access to Drake Maritime's surface-level corporate structure, enough to map the legitimate side of the business. 14 subsidiary companies, 47 active shipping contracts across 3 continents, annual revenue that placed Drake Maritime in the top tier of independent logistics firms on the eastern seaboard. Everything was clean on paper, organized with the kind of precision that either meant excellent management or excellent concealment. On the morning of the 3rd day, Kaelen appeared at breakfast and set a folder on the table beside her coffee. "There's a board meeting this afternoon at Drake Tower. I need you there." Lyra opened the folder. Inside was a single-page agenda with 7 names listed as attendees, each one followed by a title she didn't recognize from any standard corporate hierarchy. Senior Counsel, Strategic Operations Director, Compliance Oversight Chair. These weren't typical business titles. These were positions within something older and more layered than a shipping company. "Who are these people?" she asked. "The inner circle," Kaelen said. "The people who actually run things." He didn't elaborate. He poured himself coffee, checked his phone, and left the kitchen. An hour later, they were in the back of the SUV heading toward Manhattan. Drake Tower occupied a narrow but tall building on the edge of the financial district, wedged between 2 glass high-rises like a blade standing on its edge. The lobby was marble and steel, staffed by security personnel who wore suits instead of uniforms. Kaelen walked through without stopping, and every person they passed acknowledged him with a nod or a quiet, "Mr. Drake," that carried the weight of genuine deference. The boardroom was on the 32nd floor. When the elevator doors opened, Lyra could already hear voices, low, tense, the kind of conversation that stops the moment someone unexpected enters the room. It stopped the moment she entered the room. 7 people sat around an oval table made of dark, polished wood. 5 men, 2 women, all of them older than Kaelen by at least a decade. They looked at Lyra the way experienced poker players look at a stranger who sits down at their table uninvited. Measuring, skeptical, and completely unwilling to show their cards. A broad-shouldered man at the far end of the table spoke first. His nameplate read Marcus Hale, and his expression suggested he had been angry about something long before Lyra walked in. "This is the substitute?" He directed the question at Kaelen, as if Lyra wasn't capable of hearing it herself. "The Sterling family sends us the wrong daughter, and we're supposed to accept that?" A woman to his left, sharp features, silver hair pulled back tight, leaned forward. "We had an arrangement with Tessa Sterling, vetted, background checked, approved by this board 6 months ago.
Now we're sitting across from someone none of us authorized, and you expect us to continue as planned? Kaelen pulled out a chair for Lyra at the table.
She sat down, keeping her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and said nothing. She understood instinctively that speaking too soon in a room like this would be a mistake. These people didn't want her explanations. They wanted Kaelen's. Kaelen remained standing. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, placed both hands on the back of his chair, and looked at each person around the table in sequence. The room went quiet. Tessa Sterling was compromised, he said. Marcus Hale frowned. Compromised how? Kaelen reached for a slim remote on the table and pressed a button. A display screen on the wall behind him lit up with a series of financial documents, transaction records, email headers, and account routing numbers arranged in chronological order.
6 months ago, Tessa Sterling began transferring proprietary data from our preliminary partnership files to Grayson Logistics, shipment schedules, port rotation patterns, client identification codes. He clicked through the documents one by one, each screen adding another layer to the evidence. She used an encrypted messaging service routed through a personal device registered under her mother's maiden name. The transfers were small enough to avoid automated detection, but large enough to give Grayson a functional map of our Eastern Corridor operations. The room shifted. Marcus Hale sat back in his chair. The silver-haired woman's expression changed from suspicion to something colder. "You're saying the Sterling family planted her," Hale said.
"I'm saying Tessa Sterling was working with people inside her family's firm who wanted access to our network. Whether she understood the full scope of what she was doing is a separate question. The result is the same. She was a liability, and she was removed." He let that settle. Then he clicked to the next screen. "Now let me show you something else." The display changed to a different set of records. Lyra recognized them immediately. They were her own reports. Independent risk assessments she had filed 7 months ago as part of a freelance contract for a mid-level logistics firm that had been struggling with internal data leaks. She had traced the source of those leaks through 4 shell companies and 2 offshore accounts before identifying the breach point. "This analysis," Kaelen said, tapping the screen, "was conducted independently by Lyra Sterling. She had no knowledge of our organization's involvement at any level. Her work identified and neutralized a data exfiltration channel that, if left open for another 60 days, would have exposed our entire Gulf Coast shipping manifest to Grayson's acquisition team." He turned to face the room. "She saved this organization from a security breach that none of us detected. She did it without resources from us, without knowledge of us, and without any motivation beyond doing her job properly." Silence held the room for a long moment. Lyra kept her expression neutral, but beneath the table her pulse was hammering. She hadn't known. 7 months ago, when she had traced that data leak for what she thought was a routine corporate client, she had been unknowingly protecting Kaelen Drake's operation. The client who had hired her must have been one of his front companies. Marcus Hale studied her from across the table. The hostility in his face hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced by something more measured. Grudging respect, maybe, or at least a willingness to wait before passing judgment. Kaelen straightened up and adjusted his cuffs. "Effective today, Lyra Drake holds full oversight of compliance operations across all divisions. She reports directly to me. Her access level is equal to anyone sitting at this table." He looked around the room one final time. "Any objections can be submitted in writing. I'll read them when I have time." Nobody submitted anything. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, covering logistics and scheduling items that Lyra absorbed quietly while taking mental notes on every person in the room, their body language, their alliances, the way they looked at Kaelen when they thought he wasn't watching. By the time it ended, she had a preliminary map of the power dynamics in her head, and she already knew which of these 7 people would become a problem for her eventually. In the elevator on the way down, she stood beside Kaelen in silence until the doors closed. "You could have warned me," she said. "You didn't need a warning," he replied. "You needed them to see that you could handle the pressure without preparation. And you did." The elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened. Kaelen stepped out and walked toward the exit, and Lyra followed, carrying a new title she hadn't asked for, and the growing awareness that this man had been watching her work for far longer than she had realized. Brooklyn's maritime district looked different at night. During the day, it was cranes and containers and diesel trucks grinding along cracked asphalt.
After dark, the terminal became something quieter, steel silhouettes against the water, amber dock lights casting long shadows between warehouse rows, and the low hum of generators keeping the cold storage units alive. Kaelen's primary shipping terminal occupied the eastern edge of the harbor, separated from the commercial docks by a reinforced fence line and a security detail that operated on rotating 12-hour shifts. Lyra had studied the terminal's layout on the tablet during the drive from Manhattan, memorizing entry points and camera positions out of professional habit. The facility was tight, well-designed, the kind of operation that didn't leave gaps unless someone on the inside created them. And someone on the inside had created one. 3 days ago, one of our port supervisors flagged an irregularity in a routine cargo inspection, Kaelen explained as they walked through the main gate. 2 guards acknowledged him and stepped aside without asking questions. A set of encrypted server drives showed up in a container that was supposed to carry industrial pump equipment from Rotterdam. The manifest numbers matched, the customs seals were intact, but the weight distribution was off by 14 kilograms. "Someone swapped the contents after customs clearance," Lyra said. Kaelen glanced at her. "That was our conclusion too. Took my logistics team 9 hours to reach it. You got there in 4 seconds." They crossed the loading yard and entered a narrow steel staircase that led up to the terminal's control tower, a rectangular room perched above the dock with tinted windows on all 4 sides and a bank of monitors covering every angle of the facility. 2 technicians were working at separate consoles when they entered. Both stood up when they saw Kaelen. "Leave us," he said. They left. The server drives were laid out on a stainless steel table in the center of the room, each one sealed in a clear anti-static bag and labeled with a handwritten identification code. There were 9 in total, each roughly the size of a paperback book, with heavy-duty casings designed to survive rough handling during transit. Lyra pulled a chair to the table and opened her tablet, connecting it to the terminal's isolated diagnostic network through a hardline port on the wall. She picked up the first drive, examined the casing, and plugged it into a portable reader she found in the equipment drawer beneath the console. "These are custom builds," she said, turning the drive over in her hands. "The casing manufacturer is based in Shenzhen, but the internal architecture is modified. Someone added a secondary encryption layer on top of the factory standard." "Can you get through it?" "I can read the surface metadata without decrypting the core files. That should tell us who built the encryption profile and when." She worked in silence for nearly 30 minutes while Kaelen stood by the windows, watching the dock below. He didn't interrupt her, didn't look over her shoulder, didn't ask for progress updates. He simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that good analytical work couldn't be rushed. Lyra moved through the drives systematically, pulling metadata signatures from each one and cross-referencing them against known encryption vendors in her personal database. Most of the drives used standard commercial-grade security, sophisticated enough to keep out casual hackers, but nothing that would challenge a serious forensic analyst. The 7th drive, however, was different. Its encryption profile carried a digital signature, a unique identifier embedded in the code by the person who had designed the security architecture. Every encryption specialist left traces in their work, the same way a painter left brushstrokes. If you knew what to look for, you could identify the builder by the structure of their code alone. Lyra knew what to look for, and she recognized this signature. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she unplugged the drive and set it down carefully on the table. "I know who built this encryption," she said. Kaelen turned from the window. Something in her tone must have registered, because he crossed the room in 3 steps and looked at the data on her screen. "The digital signature belongs to Harlan Voss," Lyra said. "He's the Chief Technology Officer at Sterling & Associates. He's been with my family's firm for 11 years.
He built the entire internal security infrastructure for our corporate network. Kaelen studied the signature match on the screen. You're certain? I grew up watching Harlan work. I learned half of my analytical techniques from studying his systems. His encryption architecture has a specific pattern. He nests his cipher keys in groups of 3 and staggers the rotation intervals by prime number sequences. Nobody else does it that way. This is his work. She pulled up the metadata timeline on the drive. The encryption was applied 14 days ago. That's 10 days before Tessa was supposed to walk down that aisle. Whoever arranged for these drives to end up in your shipping container planned it well in advance. Kaelen sat down across from her.
The amber dock lights below cast angled shadows across his face, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something behind his composure that looked close to anger. Controlled, contained, but present. Your family's firm proposed the marriage arrangement to mine 8 months ago, he said. They positioned it as a strategic alliance, shared logistics infrastructure, mutual financial backing, combined market access. The terms were generous, unusually generous. Because the marriage was never about alliance, Lyra said, following the logic to its conclusion. It was about access. They needed someone inside your operation. Tessa was the delivery mechanism. Marry into your family, gain residential access to your estate, and create a trusted channel for moving intelligence out of your network and into theirs.
And these drives are the proof, Kaelen said, gesturing toward the table. Harlan Voss built the extraction tools. Your family's executives designed the infiltration strategy, and Tessa was supposed to be the one who carried it out from inside my house. Lyra sat back in her chair and looked at the row of sealed drives on the table.
9 devices, each one containing data that her own relatives had intended to steal from the man she was now married to. Her family hadn't just arranged a wedding. They had engineered an intelligence operation, using their own daughter as the insertion point, and they had kept Lyra completely in the dark about the entire thing.
Tessa knew, Lyra said quietly. That's why she ran. She wasn't afraid of marrying you. She was afraid of what would happen when you found out what she was supposed to do once she got inside.
Kaelen nodded slowly. Your sister may have been many things, but she was smart enough to understand that betraying me from inside my own home would have consequences she wasn't prepared to face. The terminal hummed around them. Below, a cargo crane rotated slowly on its base, moving a container from dock to truck in a smooth mechanical arc.
So, what happens now?
Lyra asked. Kaelen looked at her across the table, and his expression settled into something she was beginning to recognize. The look of a man who had already planned his next 5 moves and was simply waiting for the right moment to execute them.
Now, he said, we find out how deep this goes.
The Plaza Hotel ballroom had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged inside a European palace. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, their light breaking into thousands of tiny reflections across the marble floor. Round tables dressed in white linen filled the main space, each one surrounded by men and women who collectively controlled a significant portion of the East Coast's commercial shipping, real estate, and financial sectors. Lyra adjusted the collar of her black evening dress. This one actually fit, selected from a wardrobe that had appeared in her suite closet 2 days ago without explanation, and scanned the room from the entrance. She had attended corporate events before as a freelance analyst, usually tucked away in observation roles where nobody paid attention to her. Tonight was different. Tonight she was walking in as Lyra Drake, and every pair of eyes in this room would know her name before dessert was served. Kaelen walked beside her with the ease of someone who had grown up inside rooms like this. He acknowledged greetings with brief nods, shook hands when necessary, and introduced Lyra to each person they encountered using the same simple phrase. My wife, Lyra, delivered with a tone that made it clear the introduction was a statement of fact, not a request for approval. They had been inside for less than 40 minutes when Lyra spotted her. Tessa was standing near the bar at the far end of the ballroom, wearing a green silk dress and holding a champagne flute like she had every right to be there. Her hair was shorter than the last time Lyra had seen her, cut to her shoulders now, and she looked thinner, like the past week had been burning through her from the inside. Lyra touched Kaelen's arm. "My sister is here." Kaelen followed her gaze. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted by a fraction. Shoulders squaring, weight settling forward. The subtle physical adjustment of someone who had just moved from social mode to operational awareness. "She's not on the guest list," he said. "No, she isn't." Tessa had already seen them. She set her glass on the bar and began moving through the crowd in their direction, weaving between tables with the determined stride of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say. Two of Kaelen's security team, positioned at different points around the room, noticed the movement and began closing distance. Kaelen raised a hand slightly, palm down. The security men stopped where they were. He wanted to see what Tessa would do. She reached them near the center of the ballroom, close enough that neighboring tables could hear the conversation if they paid attention. And people were already paying attention. The Sterling family drama had been circulating through industry gossip channels all week, and seeing both sisters in the same room with Kaelen Drake was the kind of scene that would fuel speculation for months. "I need to speak with you," Tessa said, directing her words at Kaelen and ignoring Lyra entirely. "Privately. 5 minutes." "No," Kaelen said. The single word landed flat and heavy between them. Tessa blinked. "Kaelen, please, you don't understand what happened. Lyra manipulated the situation to take my place. She's been positioning herself for this since the arrangement was announced. If you knew what she's been doing behind the scenes—" "I know exactly what everyone has been doing behind the scenes," Kaelen said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I know about Harlan Voss. I know about the encrypted server drives, and I know about the data extraction protocol your family's firm designed to infiltrate my operation through this marriage." Tessa's face went pale. The champagne courage that had carried her across the ballroom evaporated in the space between two heartbeats. "I also know you ran because you understood what would happen when the operation was exposed," Kaelen continued. "That was the smartest decision you've made in a long time, Tessa. I'd recommend you keep making smart decisions, starting with leaving this room." People were watching now. The nearest tables had gone quiet, conversations trailing off as guests registered the tension radiating from the center of the ballroom. Tessa looked around and saw the attention, saw the faces studying her, and something in her composure cracked. She turned to Lyra for the first time. "You have no idea what you've walked into." Lyra met her sister's eyes steadily. "I'm starting to get a pretty clear picture." Tessa held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked back through the crowd toward the exit. She didn't look back. A few guests watched her leave, then returned to their conversations with the practiced indifference of people who understood that acknowledging someone else's downfall too openly was considered poor form in these circles. Kaelen placed his hand lightly against Lyra's back. "Let's step outside for a moment." They walked through a side corridor to a service entrance that opened onto a narrow alley behind the hotel. The night air was cool and carried the smell of exhaust and wet pavement. Two of Kaelen's security team were already positioned outside, and one of them approached immediately. "We flagged a vehicle," the guard said, handing Kaelen a tablet displaying a license plate image and a GPS tracking log. "Private car service, booked 40 minutes ago under a corporate account registered to a subsidiary of Grayson Logistics. The vehicle was scheduled to collect someone from the east entrance at 9:15. Lyra looked at the timestamp. 9:15 was roughly 10 minutes from now, right around the time Tessa would have finished her private conversation with Kaelen, if he had agreed to one. "They sent her in to pull you aside," Lyra said. "While you were occupied with Tessa, someone else was either going to approach one of your executives inside or use the distraction to access something specific." Kaelen studied the tracking log on the tablet. "The car's pickup coordinates match the east service entrance. That's staff access only. Whoever arranged this has the hotel's internal layout." He handed the tablet back to the guard. "Hold the vehicle when it arrives. Identify the driver, pull the booking records, and trace the corporate account back to its source.
I want every name attached to that transaction on my desk by morning." The guard nodded and moved away. Kaelen turned to Lyra. The alley was dim, lit by a single overhead fixture that buzzed faintly, and in that light, his expression carried something she hadn't seen before. A quiet acknowledgement that whatever was coming next would be bigger than either of them had initially calculated. "Your sister was the distraction," he said, "which means the people behind this are sophisticated enough to sacrifice a piece they've already lost in order to move a piece we haven't identified yet." "Grayson Logistics keeps showing up in every layer of this," Lyra said. "Whoever is running their strategy knows your operation almost as well as you do." "Almost," Kaelen said, "and that gap is the only advantage we need. But we can't work from the city anymore. Too many access points, too many variables. I have a secure location in New Jersey. We relocate tomorrow morning." They walked back inside through the service entrance, and Lyra spent the remainder of the evening standing beside Kaelen in a ballroom full of powerful strangers, smiling when appropriate, memorizing faces and names, and carrying the growing understanding that the web around them was tightening faster than she had projected. The Pine Barrens compound sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off a county highway roughly 90 minutes southwest of Manhattan. Dense forest pressed in on both sides of the approach, and the canopy was thick enough that even in daylight the road felt like a tunnel. Lyra watched the trees scroll past the SUV window and understood why Kaelen had chosen this place. You couldn't find it unless you already knew where it was, and you couldn't approach it without being seen long before you arrived. The compound itself was modest compared to the Long Island estate, a central lodge built from stone and timber, flanked by two smaller structures that housed communications equipment and staff quarters. A perimeter fence ran the boundary of the clearing, monitored by motion sensors and a camera array that covered every angle of approach. The staff here was smaller, 8 people total, all of whom moved with the quiet efficiency of individuals who had been trained to operate in environments where being noticed was a liability. They arrived on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Lyra had converted the lodge's dining room into a working command center. The long oak table was covered with printed documents, 2 laptops running parallel analysis programs, and a wall-mounted display connected to Kaelen's secure server network. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, starting from the edges and moving inward, building the picture one verified connection at a time. Kaelen occupied the opposite end of the table. He had his own files, physical folders in manila sleeves, each one labeled with dates and initials, and his own process, which involved reading silently for long stretches and then asking a single, precise question that told Lyra he had been following her work more closely than his silence suggested. By Thursday, they had constructed a preliminary network map that covered one entire wall of the dining room. Names, companies, financial connections, and communication pathways, all linked by color-coded lines that traced the relationships between the people working against them. The center of the map held 3 names: Harlan Voss, the Sterling technology officer who had built the encrypted drives; Margaret Calloway, a senior executive at Grayson Logistics whose signature appeared on the corporate account that had booked Tessa's car at the plaza; and a third name, Jerome Ashford, a private equity investor who held minority stakes in both Grayson Logistics and 2 of Sterling and Associates' subsidiary firms. "Ashford is the bridge," Lyra said, tracing the connection lines with her finger. "He's the only person who sits on both sides of this. Grayson couldn't have known enough about your shipping routes to plan the cargo interception without inside access, and Sterling couldn't have coordinated Tessa's placement without a strategic partner on the outside. Ashford connects both operations." Kaelen leaned back in his chair and studied the map. "I've met Ashford twice, industry dinners. He presents himself as a passive investor, the kind who writes checks and waits for returns. Nothing about him suggests operational involvement." "Which is exactly why he's effective. Nobody investigates the quiet money." They worked through the connections for another hour, cross-referencing financial filings and corporate registration records.
The picture that emerged was layered. Ashford's investment portfolio was structured through a series of holding companies that masked his level of control over the firms he funded. On paper, he was a minor stakeholder. In practice, he had enough influence to coordinate actions across multiple organizations without leaving obvious fingerprints. Around 8 in the evening, the compound's cook, a heavy-set man named Gil, who treated the kitchen like a military operation, brought in plates of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. Lyra realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast. She pushed her laptop aside and ate at the table while the network map stared down at them from the wall like an accusation. Kaelen ate across from her in the same focused silence he brought to everything. But when Gil cleared the plates and left them alone, something in the room shifted. The operational energy that had driven the day's work settled into something quieter, and for the first time since the wedding, the space between them felt less like a professional arrangement and more like two people sitting together at the end of a long day. "You built your entire career without any institutional support," Kaelen said, looking at her from across the table. "No firm backing, no family resources, no network, just your own analysis and whatever tools you could get your hands on." "I had the grant funding," Lyra said, "which, as it turns out, was you." "The funding gave you tools. It didn't give you the instinct to know where to look, or the discipline to keep working when every lead went cold. I've watched analysts with twice your resources produce half your results." He paused. "Your family never understood what they had. They treated you like a utility, useful when they needed a problem solved, invisible the rest of the time." Lyra set her fork down. The accuracy of what he'd said landed somewhere between validation and exposure, because he was right. She had spent her entire adult life being the person her family called when something was broken, but never invited to the table when decisions were made. Tessa was the public face. Her parents were the strategists. Her uncle ran the board. Lyra was the one who worked in the background, fixing things that nobody else could see, and receiving exactly no recognition for any of it. "Is that why you chose me?" she asked. "Because you thought I was undervalued?" Kaelen considered the question. "I chose you because you're the most capable analyst I've ever encountered, and because I knew that given the right position, you would be extraordinary. Whether your family valued you or not was their failure. I had no intention of repeating it." The forest outside was completely dark now. No city glow, no traffic noise, just the sound of wind moving through pine branches and the occasional call of something living deep in the trees. Inside the lodge, the overhead lights cast warm circles on the table between them, and the network map on the wall waited for tomorrow's work. Lyra looked at the man sitting across from her, this person who had studied her from a distance for years, funded her career without her knowledge, engineered a marriage that placed her exactly where he believed she belonged, and was now sitting in a remote cabin in New Jersey, sharing evidence files and grilled chicken like it was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't trust him completely. That would take longer, but she was beginning to understand him, and understanding was the foundation that everything else would eventually be built on. "We should look at Ashford's offshore accounts tomorrow," she said. "If he's coordinating both sides, his money trail will show the timing of each move. That gives us a sequence, and a sequence gives us prediction." Kaelen nodded. "I'll have the financial records pulled tonight." They returned to their respective ends of the table, and Lyra opened her laptop again. Somewhere in the data, the next piece was waiting. And for the first time in a very long while, she had the feeling that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The Sterling family manor sat on 4 acres of manicured land in Westchester County, a 40-minute drive north of Manhattan if traffic cooperated. White colonial architecture, black shutters, a circular driveway lined with mature oak trees that had been there longer than the house itself. Lyra had grown up on this property, played on the back lawn, done her homework in the second-floor study overlooking the garden. It had been her home for 18 years before she moved to Brooklyn and started building a life that didn't carry the Sterling name on every surface.
Driving back now felt like visiting a museum dedicated to a version of herself that no longer existed.
Kaelen had arranged the visit as a routine business call, a follow-up on partnership logistics related to the marriage agreement. Her parents expected a formal meeting to review financial integration terms, the kind of discussion that would involve her father's lawyers and her uncle's accountants, and several hours of careful corporate language designed to protect everyone's interests while revealing nothing of substance. That was the cover. The real objective was the home office server. "Your father's study is on the second floor, east side of the house," Lyra told Kaelen as the SUV turned onto the long driveway. "The server is in a cabinet behind the desk. It runs on the same network architecture Harlan Voss built for the corporate offices, which means the access credentials follow the same pattern. I can get in, but I need 15 to 20 minutes without interruption." "I'll keep them occupied in the library," Kaelen said. "Your father enjoys discussing market projections. Your uncle prefers talking about himself. Between the two of them, 20 minutes won't be difficult." They were greeted at the front door by Lyra's mother, who wore a beige cashmere sweater and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She embraced Lyra with the practiced warmth of someone who is performing affection rather than feeling it, then turned to Kaelen with the careful deference reserved for people who held financial power over your family's future. "We're so glad you could visit," her mother said. "Your father and uncle are waiting in the library. I've had lunch prepared." The library occupied the entire west wing of the ground floor, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather furniture, a stone fireplace that was lit even though the weather didn't call for it. Lyra's father, David Sterling, stood by the mantel with a glass of sparkling water in his hand. Her uncle, Richard Sterling, sat in an armchair with a leather portfolio across his lap and the expression of a man who considered every meeting a negotiation. Introductions were made. Hands were shaken. Kaelen settled into a chair across from David and Richard with an ease that suggested he had grown up in rooms exactly like this one, which Lyra suspected he had. Within 5 minutes, he had steered the conversation toward Drake Maritime's expansion plans in the North Atlantic shipping corridor, a topic complex enough to require detailed discussion and specific enough to keep both Sterling men engaged. Lyra excused herself with a murmured comment about freshening up. Her mother offered to accompany her, but Lyra declined with a smile and left the library through the side corridor. She took the back staircase to the second floor, moving quickly through the familiar hallway until she reached her father's study. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room looked exactly as she remembered. Dark wood paneling, a desk the size of a dining table, framed photographs of Sterling executives spanning 3 generations. The server cabinet sat behind the desk, a matte black tower connected to the house's private network through a dedicated line that bypassed the main residential system. Lyra sat down at the desk, connected her tablet to the server through a hardline port, and began running her diagnostic protocols. Harlan Voss had built this system, which meant the encryption followed his signature architecture, triple-nested cipher keys with prime number rotation intervals. She knew the pattern. She had studied it for years. Getting through the outer security layer took her 4 minutes. The files inside were organized by date and project code. Most of them were standard corporate records, contracts, audit reports, personnel evaluations, budget forecasts. She moved through them quickly, filtering by date range to focus on the 8-month window surrounding the marriage arrangement with Kaelen. She found the first relevant file 6 minutes in. A communication thread between Richard Sterling and Jerome Ashford, dated 2 months before the marriage proposal was formally presented to Drake Maritime. The messages outlined a phased strategy for establishing a trusted presence inside Kaelen's organization. The language was careful, coded in business terminology that would read as normal partnership discussion to anyone who wasn't looking for the underlying meaning. But Lyra could see the structure beneath the words. Phase 1. Propose the marriage alliance using Tessa as the connection point. Phase 2. Use Tessa's residential access to map Kaelen's internal security systems. Phase 3. Deploy Harlan Voss's extraction tools to copy proprietary shipping data and route it to Grayson Logistics through Ashford's holding companies. Phase 4. Use the stolen data to undercut Drake Maritime's contracts and force a hostile acquisition of Kaelen's most profitable shipping routes. Lyra copied the files and kept searching.
The next document stopped her. It was a contingency memo, written by her uncle and addressed to her father. Dated 1 week before the wedding, the memo discussed what would happen if Tessa refused to go through with the marriage, a possibility they had apparently anticipated well before Tessa actually ran. The contingency plan was straightforward. If Tessa backed out, Lyra would be pressured into taking her place. And once Lyra was inside Kaelen's household, the family would use a different approach. Instead of having Lyra run the espionage operation, because they knew she was too analytically sharp to be manipulated into doing it knowingly, they planned to frame her as the source of any data leaks that occurred. Every infiltration action Harlan Voss executed remotely would be routed through access points associated with Lyra's credentials inside the Drake estate. When Kaelen inevitably discovered the breach, all evidence would point directly at her. Her own family had written a plan to destroy her. They had put it in a memo, filed it on a server in her childhood home, and moved forward with it the moment Tessa disappeared. Lyra sat in her father's chair, in her father's study, staring at a document that reduced her entire value to her family down to a single function: a scapegoat. She had spent years solving their problems, protecting their interests, and building analytical tools that kept their firm competitive, and their response was to prepare a detailed strategy for using her as a disposable shield the moment it became convenient. She saved every file to her encrypted tablet, disconnected from the server, and closed the cabinet. Then she stood up, straightened the chair, and walked out of the study with the same measured steps she had used walking down the aisle at St. Jude's Chapel, controlled, deliberate, and carrying information that would change everything. Downstairs, Kaelen was still discussing North Atlantic shipping lanes with her father, while her uncle added commentary about market volatility. They all looked up when she entered the library. Kaelen's gaze found hers immediately, and something in her expression must have told him what he needed to know, because he wrapped the conversation within 3 minutes with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been planning his exit from the moment he sat down. They drove away from the Sterling Manor in silence. Lyra didn't speak until they were back on the highway heading south. "They were going to frame me," she said. "My uncle wrote it up. My father approved it. Every leak Harlan executed would have been traced back to my credentials inside your estate." Kaelen's hands tightened on his knee. It was the only visible reaction he gave. "Then we make sure every piece of evidence we have is documented, verified, and ready to deploy when the time comes." Lyra looked out the window at the passing landscape and felt something harden inside her chest. The family she had spent her whole life protecting had been preparing to sacrifice her without hesitation. That knowledge didn't make her sad. It made her precise. The Hudson River Rail Terminal occupied a sprawling stretch of industrial waterfront on Manhattan's west side, a maze of freight tracks, loading platforms, and steel-framed warehouses that handled thousands of cargo containers every week. During the day, the terminal hummed with diesel engines and the grinding of rail cars being shunted between tracks. At midnight, the yard went quiet, except for the security patrols and the occasional rumble of a late freight train pulling in from the north. Lyra sat in the back of a black command vehicle parked on an elevated service road overlooking the southern end of the terminal. 3 monitors were mounted on a fold-out console in front of her, each one displaying feeds from different sections of the yard's surveillance network. Kaelen's communications specialist, a compact, focused woman named Diane, who spoke in clipped sentences and never wasted a word, occupied the seat beside her, managing radio channels and tracking the positions of the ground team through GPS markers on a digital map. The operation had been planned over 48 hours at the Pine Barrens compound, built around intelligence Lyra had extracted from the Sterling server files. According to the documents, Ashford's network had arranged for a major freight transfer to pass through the Hudson Terminal tonight, a shipment of industrial components traveling under Drake Maritime's logistics codes. The cargo itself was legitimate. The plan attached to it was anything but. Ashford's people intended to intercept the shipment mid-transfer,
replace the manifest documentation with altered records, and reroute the containers to a Grayson Logistics facility in Newark. When the discrepancy was discovered, the falsified paperwork would show that Drake Maritime's own personnel had authorized the diversion. The result would be a paper trail pointing directly at Kaelen's operation, giving Grayson grounds to file a formal regulatory complaint and trigger an investigation that could freeze Drake Maritime's shipping licenses for months. It was an elegant strategy. Destroy your competitor by making it look like they destroyed themselves. And Lyra had to admit that whoever designed it understood Kaelen's operation well enough to know exactly which pressure points would cause the most damage. Kaelen was on the ground with a team of 6, positioned at 3 access points around the transfer zone where the cargo was scheduled to change rail lines. Lyra could see his GPS marker on Diane's tracking map, a blue dot moving steadily along the eastern perimeter of the yard, approaching the primary loading platform from the blind side of the terminal's camera grid. "Team 2 is in position at the north junction," Diane said, pressing her earpiece. "Team 3 confirms eyes on the transfer platform. No movement yet." Lyra scanned the surveillance feeds, cycling through camera angles with a rhythm she had developed during years of corporate monitoring work. The yard looked empty from most angles. Long rows of containers stacked 3 high, the skeletal outlines of gantry cranes against the dark sky, pools of industrial lighting creating bright islands surrounded by deep shadow. Then she saw it. Camera 7, covering the service road along the western fence line. A white panel van with no markings had pulled up to a maintenance gate and stopped. No lights, no engine noise visible on the audio feed. Just a vehicle sitting at a gate that should have been locked and unattended at this hour. "Diane, camera 7, western maintenance gate. That van wasn't in the baseline scan from 2 hours ago." Diane pulled the feed onto the main monitor and zoomed in. The van's rear doors were open, and 2 figures in dark clothing were unloading equipment cases onto a wheeled cart. A third figure was at the gate itself, working the lock mechanism. "They're coming in through the maintenance access," Lyra said. "That gate feeds directly to the transfer platform through the service tunnel under Track 9. If they get through, they'll reach the cargo before Kaelen's team does." Diane relayed the information through the radio. Lyra watched the GPS markers on the tracking map shift as Team 3 adjusted their position to cover the service tunnel exit. The blue dot representing Kaelen changed direction, moving south along the perimeter to cut off the approach from the western side. "Team 3, hold at the tunnel exit," Lyra said into the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline building in her chest. "Let them enter the tunnel. If you intercept at the gate, the driver pulls away and we lose the vehicle identification. Wait until they're committed." A brief pause on the radio, then Team 3's leader responded. "Copy, holding position." Lyra kept her eyes on the monitors. The 3 figures at the maintenance gate finished with the lock and wheeled their equipment cart through the opening. They moved quickly and with coordination, staying close to the fence line where the camera coverage was weakest. They had studied the terminal's security layout. They knew where the blind spots were. What they didn't know was that Lyra had identified those same blind spots 3 days ago while reviewing the terminal's surveillance architecture, and had recommended that Kaelen's team install temporary wireless cameras in each gap. The figures on the screen thought they were invisible. Lyra could see every step they took. They entered the service tunnel at 12:17. Lyra tracked their progress through the underground feed until they emerged on the platform side, directly adjacent to the cargo containers scheduled for transfer. Team 3 was waiting 15 meters away, concealed behind a row of empty flatbed cars. "Now," Lyra said. The operation lasted less than 4 minutes. Kaelen's team moved from 3 directions simultaneously, securing the access points and cutting off every exit route before the intruders had time to react. The equipment cases turned out to contain portable document scanners, blank manifest templates, and a set of digital access keys preloaded with Drake Maritime's logistics credentials, everything needed to execute the cargo diversion and create a convincing paper trail. Lyra watched on the monitors as Kaelen's people secured the equipment and detained the 3 individuals. The van at the maintenance gate was blocked by a second vehicle before the driver could pull away. Within 20 minutes, the entire operation was contained,
The cargo was secure, and every piece of equipment the intruders had brought was catalogued and photographed for evidence. Kaelen's voice came through the radio at 12:41. "Platform secure, cargo intact, all access keys recovered." Diane looked at Lyra. "Clean operation, no incidents." Lyra leaned back in her seat and exhaled slowly.
The monitors showed Kaelen standing on the loading platform, speaking to his team leader while the detained individuals were escorted to a holding area. He looked up toward the elevated service road where the command vehicle was parked, and even though Lyra knew he couldn't see her through the tinted glass at this distance, the gesture felt deliberate, an acknowledgement. She had guided his team through a live interception using nothing but surveillance feeds, spatial analysis, and the kind of tactical thinking that most people associated with military operations rather than corporate risk assessment. And she had done it from the back of a van with borrowed monitors and a radio headset. The digital access keys recovered from the intruders were the critical piece. Each one was encoded with authorization signatures that could be traced back through Ashford's network to the individuals who had commissioned the sabotage. Combined with the files from the Sterling server and the encrypted drives from Brooklyn, Lyra now had enough evidence to construct a comprehensive case against every person involved in the conspiracy. From Ashford's financial coordination to her uncle's strategic planning to Harlan Voss's technical execution. The picture was complete. Every connection mapped, every transaction documented, every name verified. What had started as a forced marriage in a Manhattan chapel had produced the most thorough corporate intelligence file Lyra had ever assembled. And tomorrow, they would decide exactly how to use it. The glass conservatory at the back of the Drake estate was Lyra's favorite room in the house, though she hadn't admitted that to anyone. It jutted out from the main structure like a transparent afterthought, iron framing and floor-to-ceiling glass panels that gave an unobstructed view of the Long Island Sound on 3 sides. During the day, light poured through every surface and turned the room into something almost too bright to occupy. At night, with the interior lamps dimmed, it became a quiet glass box suspended between the dark water and the sky. And sitting inside, it felt like floating above the world rather than being part of it. Lyra had been there since 10, curled into one of the deep cushioned chairs with her tablet on her lap and a cup of tea going cold on the side table. The evidence file was finished. Every document organized, every financial trail annotated, every name cross-referenced and verified against at least 2 independent sources. She had spent 16 days building the most comprehensive intelligence dossier of her career, and now that it was complete, the adrenaline that had carried her through the work was draining away and leaving behind something she hadn't had time to feel until now: exhaustion. And beneath that, a question she had been avoiding since the night she found the research grant records in the basement archive. She heard Kaelen before she saw him. His footsteps on the stone corridor outside the conservatory were unhurried, measured, the walk of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had no reason to rush. He appeared in the doorway, wearing a dark sweater and trousers, his suit jacket discarded somewhere in the west wing, and for a moment he just stood there, looking at her in the glass room with the black water behind her. "The rail terminal team finished their debrief," he said. "The access keys trace back to 3 separate accounts managed by Ashford's primary holding company. Diane is compiling the final verification now." "Good," Lyra said. "That closes the last gap in the financial chain." Kaelen walked into the conservatory and sat down in the chair across from hers. The lamp between them cast a low circle of warm light that ended at the edges of the glass walls, beyond which everything was darkness and the faint shimmer of moonlight on water. He was quiet for a while. Lyra had grown accustomed to his silences over the past 2 weeks. They weren't uncomfortable or strategic the way she had initially assumed. He simply didn't speak until he had something worth saying. It was a quality she had come to respect, because in her experience, the people who talked the most usually had the least to offer.
"You've been awake for 20 hours, he said.
I wanted to finish the file.
You finished it 6 hours ago. You've been reviewing it since then. She looked up from the tablet. He was watching her with that steady, attentive focus she had seen in the boardroom and at the rail terminal, the look of someone who was reading the details other people missed. Except right now, the detail he was reading was her.
I want to know why, she said.
Kaelen didn't ask her to clarify. He understood the question because it was the same question that had been sitting between them since the SUV ride from St. Jude's Chapel. He leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. It was the most unguarded posture she had seen from him. No suit jacket, no boardroom table, no operational agenda creating a buffer between them. 4 years ago, I was dealing with a situation inside my organization. A senior logistics manager had been manipulating cargo insurance claims to siphon money through a network of shell companies. The scheme was sophisticated enough that my own compliance team missed it for over a year. By the time I brought in an outside auditor, the exposure was significant. Lyra listened without interrupting. The sound moved quietly outside the glass walls, and the distant running lights of a cargo vessel traced a slow line across the dark horizon. The auditing firm that took the contract assigned a junior analyst to do the preliminary data review. Standard procedure: give the detail work to someone at the bottom and let the senior partners present the findings. The junior analyst produced a 40-page risk assessment in 10 days that identified the entire shell company network, mapped the money flow through 6 jurisdictions, and flagged 2 additional vulnerabilities in my insurance protocols that nobody else had noticed. He paused. The junior analyst was you. Lyra remembered the assignment. It had been one of her first major contracts after finishing her graduate certification, a corporate audit for a logistics firm she had never heard of, processed through a mid-level accounting practice that handled the client relationship. She had spent 10 intense days buried in financial records, produced her report, and handed it up the chain. The senior partners had presented the findings under the firm's name. Lyra had received a standard fee and a brief email thanking her for her contribution. She never learned the identity of the end client. After that, Kaelen continued, I started tracking your work. Every contract you took, every report you filed, every analytical method you developed. I watched you build a career from nothing. No backing, no connections, no institutional support, using pure capability and a level of intellectual discipline I have never seen matched by anyone in my professional life. He straightened up and looked at her directly. Your family treated you as a background resource, someone to call when things went wrong and forget about when things were running smoothly. They put Tessa forward for every public opportunity, every strategic position, every high-profile role, while you did the work that actually held their organization together. And when they needed someone to send into an arranged marriage with a man they considered dangerous, they chose Tessa, because she was the daughter they were willing to risk. You were the one they kept in reserve, because losing your analytical output would have cost them more than losing a public face. The accuracy of it pressed against her chest. She had spent years telling herself that her role in the family was a choice, that she preferred working in the background, that visibility wasn't important, that the work itself was enough. Hearing someone else dismantle that story with precise, evidence-based observations forced her to confront how much of it had been accommodation rather than preference. When your family proposed the marriage arrangement, Kaelen said, I saw an opportunity. I accepted the proposal, knowing that Tessa was the wrong fit. I had already been funding your independent work for over a year at that point. I understood your capabilities, your values, and the way you operated under pressure. I also understood that your family would never voluntarily give you the position you deserved. He held her gaze, and his voice dropped slightly, carrying a weight that she recognized as something he had been holding for a long time. So I designed the arrangement to create the conditions for Tessa to remove herself. I didn't force her to run. I didn't threaten her or manipulate her.
I simply made sure she had access to enough information about my organization's actual scope that she would realize the marriage carried more weight than she was prepared to handle. The decision to leave was hers. The certainty that she would make that decision was mine. The conservatory was silent, except for the faint ticking of the iron frames contracting in the cool night air. Lyra set the tablet down on the side table next to her cold tea and sat with his words for a long moment.
"You engineered all of this so that I would end up here," she said. "In this house, in this position, working alongside you." "I engineered the opportunity," Kaelen said. "Everything you've done since you walked down that aisle has been entirely your own. The way you handled the board, the analysis at the Brooklyn terminal, the Sterling server files, the rail yard operation. I gave you the door. You're the one who walked through it and proved that every assessment I made about you over 4 years was correct." Lyra looked at him across the low light of the conservatory. This man who had spent years watching her from a distance, recognizing something in her that her own family had never bothered to see, and then quietly restructuring the circumstances of her life so that she could finally occupy the space she was built for. "You could have just offered me a job," she said. The corner of his mouth shifted. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "You would have said no. You would have analyzed the offer, identified the strategic implications, questioned my motives, and declined on principle. I know because I modeled that scenario twice." She almost laughed. He was right. She absolutely would have said no. "So instead, you married me." "Instead, I made sure you had a reason to stay long enough to see what we could build together." The sound stretched out beyond the glass, dark and endless. Lyra picked up her tea, found it cold, and set it down again. Something between them had shifted. The professional distance that had governed every interaction since the wedding had thinned enough that she could see through it to what was on the other side. And what she found there was a partnership built on something more durable than convenience or obligation. "The file is ready," she said. "Tomorrow we deliver it." Kaelen nodded. "Tomorrow we end this." They sat in the glass room for a while longer, watching the lights of a distant vessel move across the water. Two people who had arrived at the same place through completely different paths and were now facing the same direction for the first time. Federal Plaza Annex occupied a nondescript building on a side street in Lower Manhattan, 3 blocks from the main courthouse complex. The exterior was plain limestone, the kind of architecture designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away from it. Inside, the hallways were narrow, the lighting was institutional, and every door required a keycard and a 6-digit access code. This was where the serious work happened. The cases that never appeared in press conferences, the disputes that were settled in conference rooms rather than courtrooms, the corporate investigations that could dismantle billion-dollar operations without a single headline. Lyra had spent the previous evening organizing the complete evidence file into 4 separate presentation modules, each one structured to walk a different type of reviewer through the material in the most efficient sequence. Financial auditors needed to see the money trails first. Legal arbitrators needed the communication records. Compliance specialists needed the operational timeline. And everyone needed the network map, the wall-sized diagram she had originally built in the Pine Barrens Lodge, now condensed into a clean digital format that showed every connection, every name, and every transaction in a single integrated view. She carried the file on 2 encrypted drives, one primary, one backup, sealed in a steel case that Kaelen's security team had delivered to her suite at 5 that morning. Kaelen carried a separate folder containing physical copies of the most critical documents, printed on archival paper and signed with notarized verification stamps. Between the 2 of them, they had enough material to reconstruct the entire conspiracy from its origin point 8 months ago to the failed rail terminal operation 2 nights earlier. They arrived at the annex at 8:45. The morning was overcast, a low gray ceiling pressing down on the Manhattan skyline and turning the streets into corridors of muted light.
Kaelen's driver dropped them at the side entrance, where a security officer checked their identification and escorted them through 2 interior checkpoints to a conference room on the 4th floor. The room was already occupied.
3 independent arbitrators sat on one side of a long rectangular table. 2 men and a woman, all of them senior professionals with decades of experience in corporate dispute resolution. Lyra recognized the woman, Kaelen Drake, from a financial fraud case she had studied during her graduate research. Price had a reputation for dismantling complex corporate schemes with the methodical precision of someone defusing a bomb, and her presence at this table told Lyra that whoever had arranged this meeting understood the scale of what was being presented. On the other side of the table sat 2 corporate auditors from an independent forensic accounting firm. A tall man with wire-rimmed glasses named Stafford and a younger woman named Kim, who had a laptop open and a legal pad already half-filled with notes. These were the people who would verify the financial evidence, trace every transaction through the banking system, and confirm that the money trails Lyra had mapped were accurate and complete. Kaelen and Lyra took their seats at the head of the table. No pleasantries were exchanged beyond brief handshakes. Everyone in this room understood that they were here for substance, and the sooner the material was presented, the sooner they could begin the verification process. Lyra opened the steel case, connected her primary drive to the room's secure display system, and began. She started with the network map, the complete diagram showing the relationships between Jerome Ashford, Grayson Logistics, Harlan Voss, and the Sterling and Associates executives who had designed the infiltration strategy. She walked the room through each connection methodically, identifying every individual by name, role, and specific contribution to the conspiracy. Ashford as the financial coordinator, Margaret Calloway as the operational liaison at Grayson, Richard Sterling as the strategic architect, Harlan Voss as the technical specialist who built the extraction tools, and Tessa Sterling as the original insertion point who was meant to carry the operation into Kaelen's household. Kaelen Drake asked her first question 12 minutes into the presentation. The communication records between Richard Sterling and Ashford, how were these obtained? From the Sterling family's private server, located at their Westchester estate, Lyra said. The server operates on an isolated network built by Harlan Voss using his proprietary encryption architecture. I accessed the system using diagnostic protocols I developed independently, based on my professional familiarity with Voss's design methodology. You accessed your own family's server, Price said, studying Lyra over the rim of her glasses. I accessed a system containing evidence of a coordinated conspiracy against my husband's organization and against me personally, Lyra replied. The contingency memo authored by Richard Sterling explicitly documents their plan to frame me as the source of any data breaches executed through my credentials inside the Drake estate. She pulled up the memo on the display screen. The room read it in silence. Stafford adjusted his glasses and made a note on his pad. Kim's fingers moved rapidly across her keyboard. Kaelen took over for the next segment, presenting the physical documentation related to the encrypted server drives recovered at the Brooklyn Maritime Terminal. He laid out the chain of custody for each drive, the metadata analysis showing Harlan Voss's digital signature, and the timeline connecting the drive's creation to the broader infiltration strategy. The presentation lasted 90 minutes. By the end, every document in the file had been displayed, contextualized, and cross-referenced against at least 2 supporting pieces of evidence. The arbitrators and auditors had asked a combined total of 31 questions, each one answered with specific citations from the material. Kaelen Drake closed her notebook and looked at Lyra and Kaelen across the table. The scope of this is considerable. You're presenting evidence implicating senior executives at 2 separate firms, a private equity investor with holdings across multiple sectors, and a technology officer with access to sensitive corporate infrastructure. The verification process will take time, but based on what I've reviewed this morning, the evidentiary foundation is substantial. Stafford nodded in agreement. The financial trails are clean and well documented. If the banking records confirm the transaction flows as presented, the case against Ashford's network is comprehensive.
There won't be room for the implicated parties to claim misinterpretation. The meeting concluded with a formal acknowledgement from the arbitration panel that the evidence had been received and would enter the independent review process immediately.
Kaelen signed a series of authorization documents granting the auditors access to Drake Maritime's internal records for verification purposes. Lyra provided her encryption keys for the digital files and answered 3 additional technical questions from Kim about the metadata extraction methodology. They left the annex through the same side entrance they had used that morning. The overcast sky had thickened into something closer to rain, and the city felt dense and compressed under the low clouds. Kaelen's driver brought the SUV around, and they climbed into the back seat in silence. Lyra set the steel case on the floor between her feet and leaned back against the leather headrest. 19 days of investigation, analysis, and strategic planning had been compressed into a 90-minute presentation inside a room that smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee. And now the material was in the hands of people whose professional purpose was to turn evidence into consequences.
"Ashford will know by end of day," Kaelen said, looking out the window as the SUV pulled into traffic. "His banking contacts will flag the audit inquiries. Once he realizes the scope of what's been filed, he'll try to liquidate his holding company positions and distance himself from Grayson." "He won't be fast enough," Lyra said. "The arbitration panel has the authority to freeze associated accounts during the review period. Catherine Price doesn't wait for people to cover their tracks. That's why she's been doing this for 30 years. Kaelen turned his head and looked at her. The faint trace of something warm moved through his expression. Something that might have been pride, or satisfaction, or simply the recognition that the person sitting beside him had just executed one of the most precise strategic operations he had ever witnessed. "Your uncle and your father will be contacted within the week," he said. "Are you prepared for that?" Lyra thought about the memo she had found in her father's study, the document her own family had written to destroy her, the calculated decision to sacrifice her reputation and her freedom to protect their scheme. "They prepared themselves for this the moment they decided I was expendable," she said. "I'm just delivering the receipt." The SUV merged onto the expressway heading east, and Manhattan receded behind them into the gray morning haze. Ahead, Long Island waited, and beyond that, the beginning of something that neither of them would have to build alone. 21 days. That was how long it took to dismantle a conspiracy that had been months in the making, restructure a family firm that had been rotting from the inside for years, and turn a forced marriage into something that neither Lyra nor Kaelen had expected to find when this started.
The arbitration panel moved faster than anyone anticipated. Catherine Price filed her preliminary findings within 72 hours of the Federal Plaza meeting, triggering an immediate freeze on Jerome Ashford's primary holding accounts and a formal audit of every entity connected to his investment portfolio. Ashford attempted to liquidate his position in Grayson Logistics on the second day, but the freeze order caught him mid-transaction, locking his assets in place like a hand caught reaching into someone else's pocket. Margaret Calloway at Grayson cooperated within a week. Faced with the documented evidence of her role in coordinating the cargo sabotage at the Hudson Rail Terminal, she provided a full accounting of Ashford's instructions, including recordings of 3 phone calls she had preserved as personal insurance. The recordings confirmed Ashford's direct involvement in planning the infiltration of Drake Maritime and his financial relationship with the Sterling executives who had designed the operation. Harlan Voss resigned from Sterling and Associates on a Tuesday morning, walked out of the building with a single cardboard box, and disappeared into a consulting contract overseas before anyone could serve him with formal notification. His departure was quiet and permanent, the exit of a man who understood that the architecture he had built for other people's schemes could now be read like a signed confession by anyone who knew his methods. Richard Sterling and David Sterling received their formal notifications on the same afternoon. The arbitration panel's findings stripped Richard of his board position and placed David under mandatory oversight by an independent management committee. The Sterling family firm, The company Lyra had spent her adult life quietly protecting from its own incompetence was placed into a structured reorganization process that removed every executive involved in the conspiracy and replaced them with independent professionals who had no connection to the family's internal politics. Lyra's mother called once. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Her mother asked if there was any way to reverse the process, to negotiate some arrangement that would preserve the family's control over the firm. Lyra explained, calmly and without anger, that the evidence was already in the hands of independent reviewers and that no negotiation was possible. Her mother was silent for a long moment, then said something about family loyalty that landed on Lyra's ears like a word from a language she no longer spoke. She hung up and didn't call back. Tessa sent a text message 3 days after the arbitration findings were published. It contained 2 sentences. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope you're okay." Lyra read it twice, closed the message, and didn't respond. Maybe she would eventually. Maybe she wouldn't. Some bridges needed time before you could figure out whether they were worth rebuilding or whether the river was better crossed by a different route. The Sterling employees, the 60 men and women whose jobs had been one of the reasons Lyra walked down that aisle in the first place, kept their positions under the new management structure. The reorganization protected their contracts and their benefits while removing the executives who had been gambling with the company's future. It was, in Lyra's professional assessment, the cleanest outcome that could have been achieved given the circumstances. On the 21st day, the Long Island estate felt different. The security details were still in place. The staff still moved through the corridors with their usual quiet professionalism, and the sound still stretched out beyond the terrace in its endless grey-blue expanse. But the tension that had hummed beneath every surface since Lyra arrived, the feeling of being inside a machine that was always running, always watching, always preparing for the next threat, had eased into something steadier. The crisis was over. The machinery could rest. Kaelen found her on the terrace in the late afternoon. The sun was dropping toward the mainland, painting the water in shades of copper and amber that made the sound look like it was made of something warmer than salt water. Lyra was leaning against the stone railing, her tablet tucked under her arm, watching a sailboat trace a slow diagonal line toward the far shore. He stood beside her and set a leather folder on the railing between them. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside the folder was a document, 12 pages printed on heavy bond paper, with legal formatting and notarized stamps on the final page. The header read, Co-Ownership and Operational Partnership Agreement, Drake Maritime Research and Intelligence Division. Lyra read through the first page slowly, then the second. By the third page, she understood what she was holding. Kaelen had created a new division within Drake Maritime dedicated to research, risk analysis, and corporate intelligence. The division would operate independently from the shipping and logistics operations, with its own budget, its own staff, and its own mandate. And the agreement in her hands granted Lyra full co-ownership, equal authority, equal decision-making power, equal stake in every aspect of the operation. This wasn't a job offer. This wasn't a title given at a board meeting to satisfy skeptical executives. This was a structural commitment written into the legal framework of his organization that recognized her as an equal partner with permanent authority that couldn't be revoked by anyone, including Kaelen himself. "You built this around my skill set," she said, turning to the operational mandate section. "Forensic analysis, corporate risk assessment, network security auditing. These are my exact specializations." "I built it around you," Kaelen said, "because there's no one else I would trust to run it." Lyra closed the folder and held it against her chest. The sailboat had reached the middle of the sound now, its white canvas catching the last of the evening light. Below the terrace, the water moved in slow, patient rhythms against the rocks, carrying the kind of permanence that made human problems feel temporary by comparison. 3 weeks ago, she had been standing in a church dressing room, wearing her sister's dress and reading a text message that she thought was going to ruin her life. She had walked down an aisle expecting sacrifice,
and found instead a man who had spent years recognizing her value when the people closest to her had treated it as disposable. She had uncovered betrayal from her own family, dismantled a conspiracy that spanned multiple organizations, and guided tactical operations from the back of a command vehicle at midnight, and through all of it, the person standing beside her had never once doubted what she was capable of. She looked at Kaelen. The evening light softened the sharp angles of his face, and in his expression, she found something she had been searching for much longer than 21 days. Respect without conditions, trust without reservation, partnership without hierarchy. "I have one condition," she said. Kaelen raised an eyebrow.
"The glass archive in the basement. I want full access, no exceptions." The corner of his mouth turned upward, that almost smile she had seen once before in the conservatory, the one that told her she had surprised him in a way he genuinely enjoyed. "Done," he said. They stood together on the terrace as the sun finished its descent behind the mainland, turning the sky into layers of gold and deep blue that reflected off the water and filled the air with the kind of light that made endings feel like beginnings. The folder sat on the railing between them, 12 pages of legal language that formalized what both of them already knew. They were partners. They had been from the moment she walked down that aisle. Everything since then had simply been the proof.